Hello and welcome back to this channel. This is when we talk about the idea of, is a concubine a wife? And so many people often claim that a concubine is not a wife, at least in the Bible, but simply a slave of sorts that's kept for inappropriate purposes. Now, is this what the Bible teaches? Well, first let's look at Judges 19. So in Judges 19, verses 1 through 4, it says, "And it came to pass in those days, when there was no king in Israel, that there was a certain Levite sojourning on the side of Mount Ephraim, who took to him a concubine out of Bethlehem, Judah. And his concubine played the whore against him, and went away from him unto her father's house to Bethlehem, Judah, and was there 4 whole months. And her husband arose and went after her to speak friendly unto her, and to bring her again, having his servant with him, and a couple of asses. And she brought him into her father's house. And when the father of the damsel saw him, he rejoiced to meet him. And his father-in-law, the damsel's father, retained him, and he abode with him 3 days. So they did eat and drink, and lodged there." So we see in this passage that a Levite gets himself a concubine, and then in verse 3, it calls the Levite her husband. And again in verse 4, it refers to the concubine's father as the man's father-in-law. It seems like they were considered married in this story. And so if you know the rest of the story, basically the man takes his concubine back. They pass through a city. A man of that city invites them to stay with him for the night. Sodomites surround the house, and the concubine ends up getting thrown outside. The Sodomites abuse her and leave her for dead in the morning. She goes back to the house where her husband is and falls down dead. The husband gets up and finds her dead. He takes her and then cuts her into 12 pieces and sends her body throughout Israel. And then in chapter 20, we see all of Israel gathering to this man. In Judges 20, verses 1 and 4, it says, in verse 1, "Then all the children of Israel went out, and the congregation was gathered together as one man, from Dan even to Beersheba, and the land of Gilead, unto the Lord in Mizpah." And then verse 4, "And the Levite, the husband of the woman that was slain, answered and said, I came to Gibeah that belongeth to Benjamin, I and my concubine to lodge." Again, this Levite is called her husband because she is, in this context, the woman that was slain. And so it's obviously they were considered married. And so in the life of Abraham, we see that Abraham had multiple wives. So in Genesis 25, verses 1, it says, "Then again Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah." And then it goes through verses 4, or verses 2 through 4, it talks about some of the children that she gave. And then in verse 5, it says, "And Abraham gave all that he had unto Isaac." And then in verse 6, it says, "But unto the sons of the concubines which Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts, and sent them away from Isaac his son, while he yet lived, eastward unto the east country." So we see in this passage that it is implied that Keturah is one of the concubines in verse 6. But it also says concubines, plural. It's a plural word. I believe that this is referring to Hagar, Sarah's handmaid, and Keturah. Again, of Keturah, it says that she was Abraham's wife. And then, if this is correct that she is one of the concubines, then it would be calling her the concubine of Abraham as well, even though it says that she was his wife just a couple verses earlier. And so if that's true, then it just proves that a concubine, according to the Bible, is a wife. And so, again, we can look at Jacob's situation. So in Genesis 29, verse 29, it says, "And Laban gave to Rachel his daughter, Bilhah his handmaid, to be her maid." And so Rachel's father, Laban, gave his daughter a maid. This maid's name was Bilhah. Rachel was jealous of her sister Leah because she was unable to bear children to Jacob. So she devised a plan to give children to Jacob, and that included her maid. Genesis 30, verses 1 through 4, it says, "And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister, and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, Am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? And she said, Behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. And she gave him Bilhah her handmaid to wife, and Jacob went in unto her. Because of the phrase to wife, at the end of verse 4, we can conclude that Bilhah was now married to Jacob. We see this same phrase used when Leah, which is Rachel's sister, gave her maid to Jacob as well. Genesis 30, verse 9. When Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah her maid and gave her Jacob to wife. And so we can conclude that both Bilhah and Zilpah are in the same situation. They are both wives of Jacob now. I bring this up because later on something else happens. So in Genesis 35, verse 22, it says, And it came to pass, when Israel dwelt in that land, that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah his father's concubine, and Israel heard it. Now the sons of Jacob were 12. So not only is Bilhah considered Jacob's wife, but also she is called his concubine just a couple chapters later. So while Zilpah is never explicitly called his concubine, she was clearly in the same position as Bilhah, so we can assume that she was also a concubine. Now we get a glimpse of what it was like to be a concubine in this story as well. So in Genesis chapter 30, verse 7, it says, And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again, and she bare Jacob a second son. And then in Genesis 35, verses 25 through 26, it says, And the sons of Bilhah, Rachel's handmaid, Dan and Naphtali, and the sons of Zilpah, Leah's handmaid, Gad and Asher, these are the sons of Jacob, which were born unto him in Padan. So we see that despite them being married to Jacob, these two concubines were still considered the maids of their mistresses. So it gives us an idea of the role a concubine had. You could think of a concubine as a secondary wife, or a wife with less rights. And so a concubine is still a wife according to the Bible. And so this just makes me think about Solomon and his 700 wives and 300 concubines. That would be like 700 first-class wives, and then you'd have 300 secondary-class wives. According to the Bible, from what I see in the Bible, it seems that a concubine is considered a wife in terms of how the Bible defines things. And so whenever people say that a wife and a concubine is not a wife, that's not a true statement because the Bible teaches otherwise. And so we always need to make sure whenever someone tells us something that they back it up with scripture or something of that sort, because I've heard it a couple times already in my life. And so it's something that I've been like, well, that's not technically correct because the Bible teaches otherwise. The Bible teaches that a concubine is a wife, with the examples that I gave. The Judges 19 and 20, you have Abraham, and you also have Jacob. And so the Bible teaches that a concubine is still considered a wife, despite what people say. And so there's not a whole lot more that I can say on this topic, but basically the whole point of this video is just to tell you that the Bible teaches a concubine is a wife because a lot of people say that they aren't. And so with that, really, I guess I will see you guys in my next video.